Remember the biblical sources that we looked at that posed the question to us in that first class. When can we be flexible when it comes to the kinds of obligations that Judaism and God might demand of us in a particular circumstance? When there are competing values that are also important, things like family and friends, being together as a community specifically. Sometimes these come into conflict with religious convictions. And does Judaism sort of present this dilemma in a very clear way? You know, you always choose religion over your friends and family. Or do we find room for some flexibility? And through this exploration, we're learning about other Jewish values and other Jewish ideas. And last week, we took this model of untithed produce, right? Or let me put it differently. It's not untithed produce. Produce which may or may not have been tithed, and used the exploration of that topic to learn about whether there might be flexibility in a Jewish community where not everybody is as scrupulous, as careful in their tithing obligations as others might be. So we learned about this concept called demai produce, produce which may or may not be tithed. Now, it's sort of a very peculiar, esoteric issue in the scheme of Jewish law, but it's fascinating to study within the context of our theme because it deals with different kinds of Jews, different segments of the community, and how everybody was able to get along sharing food. I said this idea of sharing food isn't just about, shul kiddush in the 20th and 21st centuries. Sharing food is what makes community. So, and always had. So, the Mishnah is about sharing food. How do you share food when the person you might be eating with is not as careful as you are when it comes to some of the religious obligations that one has to fulfill in order to serve or eat that food? So remember, damai is produce which may or may not have been tithed. Tevel is the word for produce that has not been tithed. Okay, that's why I'm careful with how I explain this. There's a difference between tevel and damai. The rabbis are strict with regards to tevel. If you know for sure that the food hasn't been tithed, well, you can't eat that. That's a Torah level prohibition. The Torah says if you eat untithed produce, you're going to be excommunicated. You're going to be cut off from the people. Why? Because the Torah says you have to give to the priests and the Levites what is due to them. And if you're eating food that is supposed to be theirs, you're going to be in big trouble. But damai, you're not sure. Why are you not sure? Because either you found the produce in another Jew's kitchen and you're not sure what happened, but most of the time, damai comes up in the context of am haaretz, people in the community who are just not as religious as you are. And they are not as careful in fulfilling the obligations as you might be. And therefore, when you eat at their table, when you eat at their kitchen, you are concerned that even if they tell you, yeah, I tithe the produce, well, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. And maybe they didn't do it the right way. Maybe they didn't know how much to separate. Can you eat with them or can you not eat with them? That was the context of our studies last week. And we reviewed different circumstances where Jewish law permits flexibility with regards to sharing food that might be damai, that might be untithed. Do you remember those areas of flexibility? Well, remember, you're traveling on the road, and the Howard Johnson's has a chef who doesn't have the best reputation. And she sees your tomatoes and she says, you know what? He's not going to know the difference if I switch his good tomatoes with my untithed tomatoes. But in the Mishnah, it says there's a way to still eat at that Howard Johnson's. You can figure it out. Just tithe before you give her and tithe when she returns the food back to you. Okay, so that's one area of flexibility, circumstance of flexibility. We learned about another case where one can have flexibility. It's at your mother-in-law's table. She's going to do the opposite of what that chef did. The chef exchanged your produce for worse produce. Your mother-in-law might exchange the produce for better produce. Well, the Mishnah says you can still eat at her house. Don't worry. I know she's not trustworthy with regards to tithing, and she has her own personal motivations, but tithe what you give her and tithe what comes back from her, and you should be okay. Then we learned about somebody who's stuck with damai, perhaps untithed produce, on Shabbos, and he's hungry. Well, we found flexibility there too. You can eat the food. You can check with him. Just ask him. Just say, did you tithe the produce? And if he says yes, even though he's a liar, and you know he's a liar, he told you that he tithed it, you can trust him. But after Shabbos, don't eat the food anymore. Then you have to tithe it. Right? That was another area of flexibility in the Mishnah. And then the final area of flexibility we saw was, remember, eating with your friend? This was the last text we looked at. When you want to eat with your friend and you're not sure that this person has been so trustworthy with regard to tithes, so the Mishnah teaches, for one time, you can eat with him. If he tells you that he tithed it, I know he's not trustworthy, but it's a friend. You don't want to lose a friend over this. If he tells you the food has been tithed, it's okay. But next week, you really should confront him and tell him, you know, I'm not going to eat with you anymore unless you follow these rules. And you have to be very careful. Because we said, a real friendship, there would be mutual respect. So today, we're going to take this one step further and look at more real life scenarios where people want to be together, want to eat together, want to share meals together, but there are conflicts because different people are holding different standards, one from the other. Is everyone ready to get started? Then I will share, just a reminder that if you want to print out the sources, there's a link in the chat box, but I am now going to share my screen so that we can all see the sources in front of us. Okay, today's class is called Balancing Reality with Principle. Okay, Shirley Ann, can you be our first victim? There you go. Now we can hear you, Shirley Ann. So if you could read, this is a source from the Jerusalem Talmud. That's what that J means. Now, we don't study the Jerusalem Talmud a lot because the Babylonian Talmud is considered to be the more complete Talmud. But there is no Babylonian Talmudic commentary on this tractate of the Mishnah. So just to give you a bit more information for those of the history nerds here, remember, the Mishnah came earlier. That came in about the year 200. It was edited by Rabbi Judah the Prince. And the Gemara, or the Talmud, is a commentary on the Mishnah. It asks questions and tries to pull it apart. The sources that we learned last week on Tractate Damai, they were all from the Mishnah. Now, if I go to the Babylonian Talmud and try to find commentary on Tractate Damai, I will find nothing. There is no Babylonian tractate of Talmud concerning the Mishnah of Damai. Why? Because the rules of Damai only apply in the land of Israel, right? The laws of tithing produce in general, this is all about tithing produce, they only apply within the land of Israel. So the Jewish scholars in Babylonia did not comment on this tractate because for them it was not applicable. But we look to the Jerusalem Talmud, which actually was written in the Galilee, but the Jerusalem Talmud does comment. There is a tractate of Jerusalem Talmud on Tractate Damai. That's why we find ourselves in the Jerusalem Talmud or the Talmud Yerushalmi. All right, so given what we learned about Damai, Shirley Ann, enlighten us about what the scholars of the Galilee had to say about this topic.
Rabbi Yanai ben Rabbi Yishmael, in the name of Rabbi Yohanan, they permitted eating Damai on the Shabbat before the wedding for fear of enmity.
Okay, so stop right there. Now let's understand what's going on. Rabbi Yochanan says they permitted eating questionable produce, right? It may or may not have been tied, in a different circumstance, one that's not included in the Mishnah. In the Hebrew, it's Shabbat Shel Protagamia. And we think the Shabbat Shel Protagamia is like what we call the Ofruf today. In those days, the wedding, actually just like in our days, the wedding was not a big affair, right? Just like we're used to nowadays. The wedding is very small. The bigger affair was held on the Shabbat beforehand. That's where everybody was celebratory, and that's where there was a party and people came to enjoy themselves. And there was a special allowance made for that Shabbat. The bride and the groom are getting married, and they allowed eating untithed produce, or perhaps untithed produce, on that Shabbat. And it also here gives the reason. This is a new reason that we haven't seen before. The Hebrew is mipnei eva, for fear of enmity. Now, why do you think, Shirley Ann, there was this allowance? What are they talking about when Rabbi Yochanan says we're worried about enmity?
Said Rabbi Abin.
No, but I'm asking you a question, Shirley Ann. What do you think? What does that mean? He's afraid for fear of enmity. Why would they allow you to eat damai, which normally, right, a pious Jew would never be able to eat without tithing it? You have to tithe it. Here, it's saying, no, you don't even have to tithe. By the way, it's not even saying you need to ask. In the Mishnah, remember we learned the Mishnah said you should at least find the host of the party and say, hey, did you tithe the produce? That's not what it says here. It says you can eat it. You can eat it. You're not sure if it's tithed or if it's not tithed. You can eat it anyway for fear of enmity. So, Shirley Ann, what do you think this fear of enmity is about?
So they don't want any of the guests to be feeling that, oh, look how wonderful, look how much, they have more than we do. Look at this wonderful spread of food.
Yeah, but what is maybe it's about jealousy. You don't want people being jealous of one another. But what else would happen if a bunch of frummies came to your ofruf and said, I'm not eating this food?
So if people turn up their noses and say, well,
you got it.
Yeah.
That's the enmity that I think the Jerusalem Talmud is worried about. And that is fascinating to me. They don't want, that's a happy occasion. That's a wedding celebration. We do not want any Jews coming to that wedding And just as you said, Shirley Ann, sticking their nose up and saying, this isn't kosher enough for me. Because in a time of joy and celebration and unity between two families, you will come in and introduce enmity, eva. You'll introduce a kind of disharmony into that scene. Isn't this incredible? It doesn't say you ask the host. It doesn't say you check in the back for the mashgiach. It doesn't say you look for the COR certificate that they force us to put in the front of every kiddush that we host at Beth Tikva. You don't even need to look for it. You're allowed to eat food. Now, this doesn't say tevel. You're not allowed to eat tevel. Tevel is food that you are sure is not kosher or has not been tithed, right? To use the modern equivalent. If you're sure that the food has not been tithed, there's no allowance here. But if it's damai is like, we're not sure where they got the tomatoes from. It could be that they did not. Basically, Rabbi Yochanan says, shut up, eat your salad, and don't ruin the party. And isn't that amazing? Be quiet. Don't ruin this beautiful affair. In the previous Mishnahs that we learned last week, nobody goes that far. I mean, you can see. Look at, here's the case with regards to, remember, you're stuck on Shabbos and you don't have any food to eat. It still says, on condition that the host, do you see where I'm reading here? Let me highlight it so you can see it. On condition that the host tell him that the food has been tithed. Right, so the Mishnah at least requires you to check, to ask, but not the Jerusalem Talmud says a wedding is different. You're ruining the wedding. You go to the wedding to have fun. You don't go to the wedding to start becoming the kosher inspector of the wedding. Stop trying to create eva. Don't bring in enmity into that scene, right? Fascinating concept. Mishum eva. This is, I want you to think about what this means, not just in this circumstance, but in many circumstances of life. In a time where you should be celebrating, in a time where there should be unity, what would Rabbi Yochanan say to us when we want to make some little issues out of our opinions about the party and the food? Rabbi Yochanan would say, shut up, enjoy the party, or leave. Pardon my French. Rabbis shouldn't be talking like this. Okay, Shirley Ann, Rabbi Abin has something else to say.
Said Rabbi Abin, the Mishnah is a case where they permitted eating untithed produce in order to promote peace.
Now, this is really crazy. Okay? Whoa.
Rabbi Mishnah,
hold on. This is not about, Rabbi Abin says, actually, it's even more than that. Notice the difference here. Make sure you notice it. Put a circle around it. Is Rabbi Abin talking about damai? No. Rabbi Abin here says something incredible. He says, actually, this Mishnah is in a case where we're talking about untithed produce. That is not the same as damai. Let me show you in the Hebrew. Rabbi Yochanan says on the Shabbat shel Protagamya, on the Ofruf, Heitiru damai mipnei eva. They allowed the damai. Damai is questionably tithed produce, so that there shouldn't be enmity. But Rabbi Avin says, Heitiru tevel. Heitiru tevelim, not damai. Tevel is produce that you are sure was not tithed. In other words, treif. Worse than treif. Rabbi Abin says, no. You're not saying enough, Rabbi Yochanan. Actually, the wedding celebration is such a joyful and happy event. They actually permitted eating untithed produce. They were, even if you are sure that it's not tithed, you can still eat it. And the reasoning is to promote peace. That's very similar, right? Fear of enmity to promote peace. Apparently, in the time of the Jerusalem Talmud, these weddings were becoming scenes. Scenes like, your mother says, don't make a scene. Scenes. That's what was going on. And Rabbi Abin was so strict, he said, I don't even want you. You go into the wedding and you eat. Don't ask. You don't need to know where the food came from. Just eat the food. Now, I want to be careful. We're talking about untithed produce here. We're not talking about, ham and cheese. However, the punishment for eating tevel, the punishment for eating untithed produce, is the exact same punishment for eating ham and cheese. I am not, God forbid, saying the two are the same. I'm just teaching Torah here. But one could make the argument that when you go to a wedding and the food isn't kosher, you can eat it in order to promote peace. I would not personally make that argument. But I think in the time of the Mishnah and the time of the Jerusalem Talmud, perhaps there was some flexibility here, because at least we know that all Jews keep some form of kosher. We just don't want the Ufraf to be the scene of division. I hope you're all, as shocked by this source as I am. Really is quite extraordinary. Shirley Ann?
Rabbi Hanina, in the name of Rabbi Yirmiah, asked, if they do so in order to promote peace, then why do we require that the Haaretz state that the produce has been tithed?
So Rabbi Yirmiah doesn't like this. For him, this is not about promoting peace, right? He looks at the other Mishnahs where it says you need to ask. You should ask the question, has this produce been tithed? And the person has to say yes in order to eat the meal. And for Rabbi Yirmiah, he says this is actually a matter of trust. This is a matter of trusting your fellow Jew. And when your fellow Jew says the produce has been tithed, you should, at the Ufraf at least, just go along with them. Don't make a scene at the Ufraf. Rabbi Abin says, no, this isn't about trust. This is about the mood of an Ufraf. At the Ufraf, there should be shalom. And so you don't even need to bother asking the question. But Rabbi Yirmiah doesn't buy it. For him, this is something else. This isn't about promoting peace. It's about promoting trust. So you do have to ask the question. The Am Haaretz, in other words, the person who is not so careful with tithing, you do have to find them and ask them, hey, has this food been tithed or not? Right? And if they say yes, even though you wouldn't normally trust them, you can still eat at the Ufraf, because we don't want to create unnecessary enmity at a happy occasion like that. Now, Rabbi Yirmiah, his rationale flows much more naturally. from what we already learned in the Mishnah, right? What we learned in the Mishnah last week, where you have to ask. You don't just assume that the food is kosher. We don't think it will create enmity to just ask your friend, hey, did you tithe these tomatoes or not? Right? His rationale here flows much better with the rest of the Mishnah. But I want to pay attention much more to the permissiveness, the flexibility of Rabbi Abin, who cares less about trust and cares more about don't make a scene, eat the food. Thank you, Shirley Ann. Just a reminder that, of course, we'll discuss this after we learn the sources. We'll have some time afterwards. We'll stay on after I stop the recording, and I'll unmute everybody so you can share your thoughts with me about this strange allowance, unusual leniency on the part of the rabbis. Okay, the next source here gets into the question of adopting the customs of a town to where you move. The particular custom that we're going to be looking at in this Mishnah is the custom of whether to work or not on the eve of Passover. Some of you might know that the eve of Passover, that is the day of that first Seder, is a special day. It's very unusual. You know, we don't even Erev Rosh Hashanah or Erev Yom Kippur. You're allowed to work on Erev Yom Kippur. You know, you should not work as late as you usually do. But it's not a day that is infused with particular holiness. But Passover is unique in that the day before the first Seder is actually a very special day. Why? Well, it goes back to the practice at the temple to sacrifice the Passover offering that day. You brought your lamb to the temple on the day before the first Seder, and even after the temple was destroyed, it retained a special status that day. Erev Pesach was a special day. And actually, there were some communities where it was forbidden to work on Erev Pesach. In other words, it was treated in almost the same way as the holiday itself. So knowing that, let's look at what the Mishnah says about different communities where there is a custom in one to permit working on Erev Pesach and a custom in another not to permit working on Erev Pesach. Marcia, would you read the source for us? Thank you.
In a place where it is the custom to do work on the eve of Pesach until midday, one may do work. Where it is the custom not to do work, one may not do work. One who goes.
So that's easy. In other words, what do we learn from that, Marcia?
You follow the custom of where you are.
That's right. Very good. What's the famous expression? When in Rome, do as the Romans do. If it's the custom of the place where you're in to work, you work. If it's a custom not to work, you don't work. What do you think the rationale is, Marcia? I mean, when in Rome, do as the Romans. Why? Where does that come from? Why?
It's also not.
Don't I have independence? Can't I make up my own mind? Why do you think, Marcia?
It reminds me of the last discussion about not making broigus, not making.
You got it. You got it. Who does this Grover think he is? He's more religious than me. If it's in a place where they do work and I say, I'm not working, right? Grover's store is closed. Who does Grover think he is? We've worked in this place for hundreds of years. He's more religious than us. Keep your religiousness to yourself. And in contrast, if it's a place where we don't work and my store is open, Imagine the kind of enmity that there will be. This Grover just wants to profit when all of our stores are closed. He thinks he's right and he's making a point of being right. So he's working and not respecting our local customs. So I think you're right, Marcia. It is about broigus. Don't be different. Don't separate yourself from the custom of the local community. Now let's take this a bit further, a little bit more complicated here. Go ahead.
One who goes from a place where they work to a place where they do not work, or from a place where they do not work to a place where they do work, the restrictions of the place one came from and the restrictions of the place one went to both apply.
So what does that mean? The restrictions of the place you came to or the place you're going to both apply. It means if you're moving, you can't work, period. Even if you're moving to a place where they don't work, it's clear you can't work, right? That's the restriction of the place you are going to. But even if you're going to a place where they don't, where they do work on Erev Pesach, you are still not allowed to work because you keep the restriction of the place you are coming from. Now that's odd. Wouldn't you think, hey, I moved to a new city, I change, now I want to do the work. So I wonder what is behind this restriction that if you come from a place where you didn't work, you can't change. You can't start working. You can never, ever work. If you're born in a city where they don't work on Erev Pesach, you have to observe that for the rest of your life, no matter where you are working. And what does the Mishnah say at the end?
But that, just before I read that, that contradicts what we just said, that you follow the custom of where you are. So
that's right. That's right.
One should not act differently from local custom on account of the quarrels which would ensue.
Right. And there you go, Marcia. It's emphasizing, well, hold on here. There's some tension here that we don't understand, right? We just learned you don't act differently from the local custom, mipnei hamachloket, because you're going to create controversy, quarrels. But on the other hand, when you're moving to a place where they don't work, you shouldn't, where they do work, you shouldn't take this leniency upon yourself. So we need the Talmud to help us sort this out. What is it that we actually, what makes sense here? What is it that we actually should be doing? So thank you, Marcia. Fran, would you read for us from the Babylonian Talmud? I need you to unmute. Thank you, Fran. Now we hear you. Okay.
Okay. Granted, in the case of one who travels from a place where people perform labor to a place where they do not perform labor, the sages impose the stringencies of the place to which he went, and a person should not deviate from the standard practice in that place due to potential dispute, and he should not perform labor.
Right. So the Talmud says, look, this all makes perfect sense if I moved from a less religious city to a more religious city. If I moved to, with regards to working on Erev Yontif, right, on Erev Yontif of Pesach, if I move to a more religious city, obviously I should not say, hey, I come from a city where we work, so I'm allowed to work. That will create fights. When you move to a city where they don't work, you should adopt their custom, change from what you've been doing in the past to avoid controversy, to avoid dispute. But now the Talmud's going to say something. Hey, we realize the contradiction or the issue that Marcia noticed. But what if it's the opposite? Go ahead, Fran. However,
However, if one traveled from a place where people do not perform labor to a place where they do perform labor, is the ruling there too that a person should not deviate from the standard practice in that place due to conflict and perform labor.
Right. So go ahead, Frank, keep reading.
Okay, that cannot be.
Right.
Didn't you,
That can't be. It can't be because
didn't, yeah,
that we learned you don't create controversy. You don't create well, here you're going to be in a city where everybody's working, and you, Mr. Religious, are going to say, no, 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 I don't work. I don't work on Erev Yontif. I'm more religious than you. Well, that's going to create controversy. So that's why the Talmud notices, Marcia, what exactly you said and says, that can't be. You're going to create controversy. We learned you don't deviate from local custom. Didn't you say? Go ahead, Fran.
didn't you say the sages impose upon him the stringency of the place to which he went and the stringencies of the place from which he left? He should not perform any labor.
Right. So he shouldn't perform any labor. That's what we learned. So in other words, there's a contradiction here that we need to resolve.
Okay.
So what is the resolution? Go ahead, Fran.
Rava said, refraining from labor does not constitute a deviation that causes dispute.
What is that about? If I don't work, it's not going to create a dispute. The other people in the town who are working, they won't care. Why? Go ahead, Fran.
You think one who sees him will say that he is not working because he believes that performing labor is prohibited, contrary to local practice. No, instead they will say, there are many idle people in the market every day who do not work.
Isn't the Talmud so smart? Look what it's saying. I'm not opening up my store because I'm keeping the custom of the place where I come from, which is not to work on Erev Pesach. But when people see that I won't open my store, they're not going to say Grover didn't open his store because he thinks he's better than us and he's more religious than us. No, 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 no. What are they going to say? Grover's lazy, and he's got a big Seder coming up tonight, and he's probably just exhausted with cleaning the house and everything, and he's just being lazy. There are many idle people in the market every day who do not work. Isn't this Talmudic brilliance, right? Yeah. They try and imagine the situation and the disputes that it might cause. And actually, there's some truth to it. If you think about it, think about a mall, right? The stores, in other words, stores that are very close together. If all the stores are closing because it's Thanksgiving, and one store says, we're going to stay open, and they get all the business, right? Well, those other stores are going to be really, really upset. How dare you? Now you're going to put pressure on us to open up on Thanksgiving, and we used to like having that day off. You're ruining everything for us. So we understand that scenario. When you move to a place where the stores are closed, you shouldn't be the one store that's open. You're going to create a big dispute. But if at the mall all the stores are open and your store is closed, well, actually, not only will people not mind, they might be happy because all of your customers are going to come to our store. And we're going to get the business that you're choosing to lose. So it's very smart, this section of the Talmud, saying, if you came from a place where they don't work, you should never, ever work on Erev Yontif. And you don't ever have to worry about working on Erev Yontif, because if you move to a city where they do work, they won't care anyway that you shut down. All of this is to create a world that minimizes machloket, or for the Yiddish people, machloikis. a world that minimizes machloikis. Every situation is different. Every custom is different. And if you're doing something to stand out and that's going to upset people, you really should reconsider, because we believe in a tradition that minimizes friction and disharmony and fighting over silly things. But if you want to, maintain your custom, which is a little bit more strict, but it's not going to disturb anybody else. Nobody's going to be bothered. In fact, they might even like that you're taking the day off. Well, then you're not disturbing anybody and you can do what you want. So take this scenario and apply it to many, many other different cases where these values come into conflict. What do you think this Talmudic passage is teaching us? Now, the danger, of course, with this passage is, well, how far can I take this? How far can I take this allowance? You're telling me, basically, with regards to not working on Erev Yontif, that I can never, ever work again, no matter which town I move to. You're also saying that if I do have the custom of working, that I should change and do what the people do around me. Well, how far does that extend? Is it just, are we talking here just about working on Erev Pesach? Or could we apply this even to other Jewish areas of practice, like keeping kosher, keeping Shabbat? So let's see how far. This is going to be the question that the Rishonim, the commentators of the Talmud, that they have. So let's look at one of those commentators on the Talmud, one of the Rishonim. His name is the Rosh, Rabbenu Asher, and he has something to say about what we just learned. Who shall I pick on next that I haven't picked on in a while? Debbie, are you able to read for us? Debbie Gollum, are you able to unmute?
Okay.
Hey, we got you. We can hear you. Hi,
Got me.
Debbie. How are you?
Oh, surviving.
It's good to see you. Thanks for participating in our class.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank
Nice
you.
to see you on Zoom. You're getting the hang of it, I see.
I'm
With some help.
trying. Yeah.
Would
All
you
right.
kindly read for us this short passage from the Rosh?
Rosh Pesachim.
Yes.
This applies then when it is impossible to adopt both stringencies without causing a dispute. Without causing a dispute, he should perform malacha with them, for great is peace, and he should violate the practice of his place, given that there is no biblical prohibition involved. Rather, it is just a prohibition that they took on as a stringency.
Very good. Thank you. So the Rosh says something here. He adds a layer to the story that I think is rather important. He says, don't take this too far. And also pay attention to why we are giving this allowance to the immigrant to not work. We're allowing him to not work because we don't think it's going to create strife. But if it will, right? Remember, the Talmud says people are just going to say Grover is lazy. But maybe they won't say that. Maybe they'll say something else. Maybe they'll say, no, this isn't, it's not Grover being lazy. It's Grover being self-righteous. And in a place where they'll say that, in other words, it's going to create a dispute, he should perform melacha with them. You should open up your store. In other words, it depends. It's like every situation is different. Every city is different. If you're in a city that's sort of looking to pick fights and is very sensitive about these issues, just go along with them. Don't make a big to-do over your own custom. But if you're in a city where the people are sort of dumb and they're just going to say, hey, Grover probably is just lazy. In other words, they're not going to put two and two together and realize why I'm not working. Well, then you can keep your custom. It all depends on the uniqueness of the situation. And if you get any sense inside of you that by you acting differently than everybody else, you're going to create a scene, you're going to create machloikas, you're going to create strife. If there's any part of you that says, by me being different, that might happen, you should not practice anything differently than what people are practicing in that city, in that place. Right? And the Rosh says here, the reason is because great is peace. In the Hebrew, Gadol HaShalom. Shegadol HaShalom. Everything you do should be in order to preserve peace among the community. Now, he says here, he qualifies it by saying, now remember, this is about minhag. This is about a custom. It's not about an isura de oraita. It's not about a biblical prohibition. We're talking here about changing the custom of your behavior from one city to another. But if you move to a place where they're eating ham and cheese, you don't say, oh, I'll eat ham and cheese because all the other Jews are eating ham and cheese, so I won't create machloikas. That's a different scenario, right? There are lines that we don't cross. But when it comes to customs that are just being taken on as stringencies, and an example is not working on Yom Kippur, or somebody in the chat box says, whether I stand or sit at Kiddush, right? Some houses they stand, some houses they sit. This is custom. It's not law. There's no law that says you have to stand or you have to sit. So on those sorts of questions, on those sorts of issues, don't create a machloikas. If you feel that you will create some sort of an issue at the table by following your custom, which is different than the custom of your host, you should just go along with what your host is doing. Okay, thank you, Debbie. And finally today, the Mishnah Brura, which is a 19th century source, right? When it comments on this whole story about when to keep customs and when to change your custom, he gives an interesting ruling. Frida, would you read for us?
Mishnah Brura. But this only applies when the action in question is not truly forbidden. But but there is a mere custom to be strict.
Right. So you see, he's worried about the same thing the Rosh is worried about. He says, look, we don't want people taking on customs of the place they're going to when that custom is actually violating a matter of Jewish law, right? That's a different story. When you go to somebody's house and they're violating something that's really a clear prohibition in the Torah, you're allowed to create strife. You're allowed to say, not for me. But don't make a fuss over nothing. Don't make a fuss over things that are not really questions of forbidden or permitted. It's just questions of customs. What does he say, Frida?
But if something is truly forbidden, even on a rabbinic level, God forbid, to violate it on account of the fear of enmity and dispute.
Right. So this idea of fearing enmity, not creating controversy, it only can be used to justify a change of behavior to a certain degree. Don't say, I'm going to eat a ham and cheese sandwich because I don't want to create enmity or dispute. And he says, even on a rabbinic level. So there's certain sins that are on a rabbinic level prohibited. Even for that, you can't say, well, I just went along with it because I didn't want to create a whole scene. Better
he should suffer fights and not violate a rabbinic command. For one who violates a rabbinic command is liable for death at the hands of.
Right. So you see how the Mishnah or the Mishnah Brura, right, in the age where there is something called orthodoxy, and how he takes this idea of great is peace and not creating strife, and sort of rips it apart and says, listen, in our day, this really rarely applies. It rarely applies, because the people that we are sharing meals with, the people that we're together with, they're violating things that are worse than customs. Today, we're dealing with people who are not just violating customs, they're violating core Jewish ideals and beliefs. And for issues like those, it is worth causing a fight. It is worth creating controversy. Interesting how those ideas develop in the modern period, much more than they are well developed before, the schisms in Judaism into different movements. So those are the sources I wanted to look at with you today, seeing where we can find flexibility. We saw a source that says when it comes to weddings, you can even eat tevel. You can even eat surely untithed produce, even if nobody tells you they were tithed, because you're going to ruin the party if you create a scene. And then we looked at this question about working on Erev Pesach, which is a question of custom, and how one can be flexible and adjust and change on issues that are just custom in order to preserve the shalom, the peacefulness of the community, the relationships of the community. You shouldn't always be standing on principle when the welfare of the community is at stake. I love these sources. I could teach them every Shabbos. As a pulpit rabbi, you get there's a lot of people who make such a big deal out of nothing, right? Of course, none of you who are attending my class, but sometimes you say, you're going to create such friction in the community about nothing. I can't tell you how much of my job is spent dealing with these issues that you would call, they're really about custom. Like we're fighting about what time to have services on Friday night. Should it be 5:30 or 5:45 or 6 o'clock? Now, I'm not saying it's not an important question. We should talk about these things. But sometimes the amount of energy that people have to fight for their cause, you would think that they're fighting for core Jewish values, the kinds of things that the Mishnah Brura is saying, yeah, you create a fight over this issue. But instead, it's an issue that, like, you want to show them that source in the Rosh and say, hey, you're creating machloket, you're creating enmity among people for custom, for things that really don't matter, that are just matters of preference. Save your energy, save your fights for the things that really do matter. So if I could teach these sources just before every sermon, I would do that, just to remind people, hey, there's something called shalom in Judaism. Don't forget that. What have you done lately to increase shalom in the community? Did you know that it says that in order to keep shalom, you should abandon what you used to do in the shul you came from or in the home you came from and do what the community does? Because some things just aren't worth picking a fight over. And there's enough strife and conflict and issues separating people in the world. We want to make sure that whenever it's possible to build a bridge, whenever it's possible to have more shalom in the world, that's the path we choose.